Northern New England Poison Center quite regularly. And let's go. So this is what we're going to cover. And I'm going to cover fairly rapidly, just a general introduction, some common poisoning scenarios I've run into over the years. I've been consulting as a volunteer with the Poison Centers now for about 20 years. I'm going to dive into some of the range of toxins and some of the common northeastern mushrooms responsible. And I'm going to talk about the trends as they have changed over the years, which is really the decisions leading to oops. And I do want to pay homage to the Maine Mycological Association. Knowing that Michaeline was going to be introducing me, I decided to kind of feature her on this. That's my home club and my friends. And Michaeline and I have been partners in mushrooming for a number of years since we met over Elateoporus sulphureus. And she claimed it was hers, I claimed it was mine, and we somehow became friends. So disclaimer, I don't have a lawyer, but if I had one, they would say I need to do this. So mushroom foraging, eating mushrooms, it's a pastime that I love, it's rewarding, and there's some risk. This talk is absolutely not designed as the sole preparation for making decisions on eating or not eating mushrooms. Learn your mushrooms and then guardedly, carefully, and with enthusiasm, dive in to eating them. And that's where the enthusiasm is. I've seen the rise in interest in mushrooms growing for, the 30 years I've been teaching them. And then it just spiked recently. And it spiked even before that movie came out, The Fantastic Fungi, and was really increased by the fact that we're in a pandemic. People are interested in sustainability and locavore and collecting their own food, and mushrooms are right in there. It's the thing, it's a trend. And during the pandemic, at least in our area in Maine, the great outdoors beckoned. It was safe. And so people streamed out into the fields and forests as a way of recreating. And there's also that piece, the conspirators believing that we need to build self-sufficiency and dry mushrooms and canned mushrooms. I know a number of people who dove into that last year. So everybody's interested. Everybody's interested. And yet we need to bring the caution. And I add this photograph. Most of the photographs in here are mine. Most of them are Maine-based. There's some that I've acknowledged that I've gotten from other sources. This is a king bolete that I was on a Maine Mycological Association foray, and I stopped at this place on the way there, and I saw this beautiful sep, and I leaned down to pick it, and I saw the mushroom sprouting out right attached almost, so close to the stipe. And I picked it before I stopped to take a picture. So I took a picture after this beautiful, perfect little button Amanita crenulata emerging at the base of the stem. So always caution, always thoughtfulness is called for. And the other thing that I'm worried about, and I'm worried about it quite mightily, is that this passionate interest in mushrooms is here, and foragers only know what they know, and they may learn in a haphazard manner. And what I'm seeing is some people, their enthusiasm and their egos are urging them to push limits of edibility, what we can eat, what we should eat. Oh, those mushrooms that we said were problematic, we're going to try those. And these are risk takers, and yet they're extroverted risk takers. And so they're spreading their message, and I worry about it. I worry about the assumptions. So this was a post of a fellow who is hosting dinners, eating extreme rare mushrooms. And boy, sooner or later, I'm going to get a call from the Poison Center saying, well, we got another one for you. So it worries me. In terms of the number of poisonings we've had, 2018 through 2021, we had several known deaths. Most recently, if you read Michael Bogue's report, I'm not sure if we had any deaths last year, but most of the deaths when they come up are related to amatoxins, no surprise there, but a whole lot more people sickened. And my experience in the work that I do through the Northern New England Poison Center, which covers Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, there's been a significant increase in exposures that are symptomatic. Many of them, or most of them, by novice foragers making assumptions, or people who were gifted mushrooms from people who were foraging and making assumptions. So of those, we've had several, deadly amanita exposures that have resulted in pretty significant symptomatology, significant hospitalizations, no deaths up here. We've also had a real rise in the pantherine syndrome amanitas, Muscaria, Volatipes, crenulata. We've had a number of bolete exposures, gastrointestinal symptoms. We're going to talk about all these in more detail. Jack-o'-lantern, every year, I deal with a few cases of people dining on jack-o'-lantern, thinking they're chanterelles. We'll talk about that. Pigskin puffball, honey mushrooms and bluets especially, consumed raw, false morels occasionally up here, and a whole lot of idiosyncratic reactions. So the scenarios that we deal with here significantly, and some of this is true across the country, roughly 8 out of every 10 calls, a little less recently, involve toddlers, that grazing stage of life where young people are exploring the world through their mouth impulsively. A caregiver sees them and really gets quite excited and freaked out. And of course, there's a need to identify. Most of those are asymptomatic. Every year, and I suspect this is true in other parts of the country, we have visitors to Maine or to New England who come from really distant places, oftentimes Europeans, some Asian, some from the Western United States, and they're collecting and eating our mushrooms without a local knowledge base, and they make mistakes. The biggest cause, and particularly recently, is novice foragers who either are making assumptions or they're careless. We'll talk about some of those, and a lot of those are misapplied generalities, and we'll talk about some of that. And the last two is magic seeking, people seeking psychoactive mushrooms, but not doing their homework in terms of identification. And the last one, I have no idea how to combat, and that's magic thinking. The person who found the beautiful, pure, angelic white Amanita bisporigera and said something that white and pure could not be toxic, it must be edible. And that was their basis for making a decision on eating it. Magical thinking. I don't know how to combat it, but it happens. So some of the things we see include, in terms of myths that people buy into. These include people that, believe that any mushroom fruiting on wood is not poisonous. And it goes by that old generality, which is still not true, that the polypores fruiting on wood are not toxic. And some of them, of course, are. There's that assumption or myth that if an animal can eat this, I see that evidence of mammals, rodents or insects or slugs or snails, then it must be edible for me. And of course, we don't know the outcome for the slug who ate that Amanita bisporigera, but it's certainly no basis upon which I'm going to decide to eat something. There's an old, and it still comes up, an old myth out of Europe that I still do not understand the basis for, that if you cook your mushrooms with a silver coin or a piece of silver, so long as that silver does not turn black, the mushrooms are safe. And I suspect and I would love to hear if anyone knows in this group what toxin group that might have been an indicator for, because it certainly doesn't cover all toxins. I still hear it. My grandmother always did. And a belief that cooking mushrooms will break down the toxin. And obviously with some mushroom groups, that's very true. They're heat labile, they'll neutralize it. But with others, including the amatoxins and phallotoxins, not true. So other myths that may be true that, that I often run into, people believe if I'm touching a mushroom, I'm going to get sickened. And the reality is you've got to eat it. You've got to eat it, and handling it is not going to cause problems, with the exception of a few mushrooms, like some of the slimy capsulis, and occasionally the jack-o'-lantern mushrooms. They will cause a contact dermatitis, a rash. Breathing spores will not sicken you. You will not get the toxins that way. And there's some exceptions to that. We've certainly learned in the commercial growing industry that people harvesting oyster mushrooms, and also some people who harvest shiitake develop a problem. And some of it's an allergic reaction. And we also know that those kids that get the puffballs and pop one in the face of their friend to torment them, taking a big whiff of those concentrated spores can be problematic. A true one that I like is that few mushroom poisonings are potentially fatal. And in emergency departments across the country, for a long time, good care providers were overreacting if someone came in with symptoms of mushroom poisoning or report of a mushroom poisoning. And we've learned to slow it down and to treat the symptoms, not the mushroom. And what I've learned in the work that I do is that oftentimes, or at least sometimes, the whole story is not what I start with. That there are times when I interview someone, or I get the interview from the Poison Center, and they'll tell a story about what they ate and how much and how it was prepared. And sometimes it's the next day when I hear the next level of that story, or even several days later. So I've become patient in terms of what I learn and take. Oh, I'm just going through and seeing some of the stories in the chat. I like them. I really very much appreciate you putting in your hard-earned lived experience into the chat so we can teach each other. So range of toxins, and we've done a lot of work in this country and around the world, kind of classifying toxins into groups by their mode of action. And we're also always learning more. So I love the old traditional saying, all mushrooms are edible, but some only once. And I really appreciate this illustration from Kristen Huntley of the death caps in a skull. Just perfect combination there. So we classify the toxins, and we've added some over time. So I'm going to talk about these groups and not anything about treatment, a little bit about symptomology, and more about the mushrooms that tend to trigger those symptoms and the experiences that I've had or have been aware of in the Northeast. So there's a whole groups, and so I'm not going to go into those right now. We are not going to go into as much detail as I would like in some of the newer ones, but let's see how far we go. You're going to start with the cyclopeptides, the amatoxins, the phallotoxins, as I say, the really bad ones. And there's several groups of toxins where there's a delayed onset of symptoms, and this is one of them. And that amatoxin and phallotoxins are responsible for certainly the significant majority of severe poisonings and deaths worldwide, maybe up to 90%. These are toxins that are not impacted by cooking. They must be eaten. And by every report of someone I've interviewed that's eaten an amatoxin containing mushroom, they taste good, by and large. So Amanita phalloides, the death cap, So far, there's been one report of them in Maine. I have not come across them to photograph them myself. So the two photographs I have are from Wikipedia and Wikicommons. So the cyclopeptides, the initial symptoms typically around 8 hours, 6 to 10 hours. I'm aware of one case down in New York State where there was a massive amount eaten, where the symptoms started a little earlier. And those initial symptoms are very severe gastrointestinal. Vomiting, nausea, very severe diarrhea, and mucousy diarrhea, even bloody diarrhea. And those symptoms last 24 to 30, sometimes even a little bit more hours, but typically around 24. And then they remit, and people are okay. And unless someone has been testing liver function, if someone suspects an amatoxin-containing mushroom, someone might be released to return home. And that latent phase lasts for 24 to 36 hours, and then they may return with signs of acute liver failure as the toxin builds up in the liver and the bile ducts, secondarily, or at times the kidneys, and then the onset of liver failure, secondarily kidney failure, and without death, without intervention, if it's a lethal dose, death in 4 to 6 days. And about 50% mortality in areas where there is not good care, and maybe 5 to 10%. We've always said 10%, but some recent information I was looking at says maybe closer to 5% in this country with good care. And certainly the severity of the outcome is related to how much of the toxins you've taken in. With there's groups of mushrooms that contain these. Certainly Amanita phalloides is a huge one, but any of the destroying angel group, Bisporagira virosa, if you still use that name, Magnivalaris, Galerina marginata, the little brown mushrooms, contains those. Foliotina rugosa, which I find really common in certain areas up here, and several small lepiotas. So I want to talk about the phalloides because, further south from Maine, southern New England, New York, New Jersey, it's become fairly endemic. This is a mushroom that is native to Europe and Eurasia, was brought into this country on nursery stock, and has really gotten established very strongly on the West Coast, and now in pockets or across the country and in parts of the East Coast, and I expect it coming up this way. So we've, as I said earlier, reported only once from Maine. I did not see that mushroom. I wish I had, but I'm expecting it to come up here as global warming and changes in the growth of trees. So look in your area, look for it in a tree plantation or a park near you. Closer to home, the much more common across much of New England is Amanita bisporagira, the destroying angel, and a related one I'm going to talk about in a minute. So really common mycorrhizal that we see very typically in August and into September, occasionally early October. That pure, magically white skirted stalk, very distinctive. In this area, one of our more common deadly species. Last year, with an abundance of rain, we saw this in very significant numbers and robust ones of the Bisporagira. We also see, and I remain confused about exact species on this. So I've always called it Magnivalaris, but Magnivalaris, the original description says it typically fruits singly. And I do find this occasionally fruiting singly, and they must be related species. But this one I find often in cespitose clusters, in more sandy soil with oak trees, and the Elliptosperma is not known to associate with oaks, but it's a robust, beautiful mushroom. Faint smell of potatoes, with a really significant membranous ring, that annular ring. And one of the places I first found this was just down the hill on the property of a high school. And it grows under the sandy soil under oaks. And every year there are just dozens and dozens that come up when it fruits. So I find it further south in Maine, and it's reported to be more common south from Maine. And another one which is underreported, and we don't often see poisonings cases related, but it's one of those little brown mushrooms that people seeking out psilocybin and not doing their homework might collect. It's another one that I more worry about with the grazing stage kids. We find this growing from wood mulch, and we're using wood mulch all over the place, or wood waste. And that pale collar-like ring that you can slide up and down is very distinctive. These do contain amatoxins. I find them typically in Maine in September, in sometimes large numbers along the edges of woodland paths where they've used wood chips to coat the path. I'm curious how you see it. We used to always call this Canosope filaris, but it's now pretty established in the Foliotina group. And by now, with taxonomy, it could be someplace else, and I'm behind the times. So Galerina marginata, used to lump this as Galerina autumnalis, very, very common in New England, typically in the fall. Occasionally it's reported in the late spring as well, growing on fairly well-rotted wood. And this is a typical patch of it, just kind of on a well-rotted log in the late fall, fruiting singly or in groupings. This year, again, there was plenty of that around. Again, fairly significant amount of amatoxins, and most problematic historically in people who make mistakes in what they're collecting, particularly those seeking psilocybin, or occasionally reported, somebody mistaking them for honey mushrooms. Now, how that can happen in terms of somebody who's aware, I don't know, but we all know people make mistakes. So moving out of the amatoxin group and into this group 2, class 2, which is the monomethylhydrazine, gyromitrin. And gyromitrin in our bodies is converted into monomethylhydrazine in the gut. And monomethylhydrazine is a very volatile, very toxic, and in large doses has caused severe sickenings and even death. This is a mushroom, the Gyromitra esculenta, which is revered in Finland. It's kind of, this is the mushroom they eat. And the Finnish food safety people will give you they require, if you sell it to the public, that you give them information about how to properly cook it. So if you eat this mushroom, delayed onset of up to 24 hours, vomiting, diarrhea, pain, followed by just a range of neurologic and other types of major organ problems, and sometimes leading to death. And I was in touch with someone in Finland who was trying to be protective. They said, well, we eat this all the time, and last year we had 17 deaths by mushrooms, and only 4 of them were caused by Gyromitra esculenta. So what we're saying is 25% of the deaths by mushrooms caused by these species, and you're defending it? I worry about that thinking. So people eat these mushrooms, and with the gyromitrin being volatile, the Finnish food safety says, all right, you take the mushrooms you're going to eat and you put them in a large container of water and you bring that to a boil, and you boil them for 15 minutes, and then you pour that water out you replace it with cold water, and you repeat that process. Boil it for 15 minutes, pour that water out, and then you cook them for food. And oh, by the way, while you're boiling them, make sure you're in a room that is well ventilated, because the vapor is also toxic. So my take on this is, why bother? Why bother eating a mushroom that is that problematic? So there's a couple different groups that contain the gyromitrin. Certainly Gyromitra esculenta is the most famous, but also infula, ambigua contain those different false morels. This pseudo-rhizina sphaerospora, sometimes lumped into Gyromitra sphaerospora, is also reported to contain gyromitrin. I personally have only found this one time in northern Maine. I don't know how common it is anywhere. Beautiful little mushroom. And certain Helvellas and Verpas are being tested with that concern around gyromitrin. But this one, the classic false morel, Gyromitra esculenta, it is the more common form, what we find in Maine. It's a classic spring mushroom. We typically find it associated with pine, and it fruits earlier than the blondes or the true morels, or overlapping them at about the same time as some of the black morels are fruiting. In here, much more common than the true morels. And we've had some severe poisonings in northern New England, no deaths that I'm aware of. Now, often when I'm doing teaching, workshops and such, people say, wait a minute, that's what I've been calling a morel for years, particularly in northern Maine, and particularly for folks who've been foraging on their own for years. So be aware. Here we find it coming up about the same time that the violets are blooming. And sometimes I find, in fact, I find them together, the morels and the false morels. We also, up here, and is more common further south, is Gyromitra corfii, Gyromitra gigas. I'm not sure where the one ends and the other begins. These are more pale, kind of yellowish tan, more stocky and short, the fat stipe, still hollow. And here's one with the true morel, the true false morel, Gyromitra esculenta and Gyromitra corfii together, collected in the same region, not the same place, about a half-mile away. And the one that grows further south that I'm aware of being eaten pretty commonly is Gyromitra brunea. And I'd love, if someone talks about their use of that. It is any of these would be toxic if they were eaten raw, but well cooked, they're being commonly eaten, and people are kind of pushing some of the limits on that of acceptability. So in my part of Maine, which is along the coast, mid-coast area, I sometimes have found the false morel, both esculenta and corfii, as well as true morels on the same day. So there is definite overlapping. Moving on, the third category is the muscarine containing mushrooms, and they trigger what we call sludge with a pretty rapid onset, 20 to 40 minutes typically. And the sludge stands for salivation, lacrimation, tearing, urination, defecation, GI hypermotility, I'm not quite sure exactly all that means, and emesis. And we had a pretty severe poisoning with that in the United States last year. It has caused lethality at high doses, and that vomiting, diarrhea, slow heartbeat, tearing, may occur certainly. And what we know, this is a kind of cholinergic triggering. And if you give atropine, it clears up. That's one of our only mushrooms where there's a clear antidote, if you know what the person has eaten or suspected. And that combination of symptomology is probably pretty clear. So found in a number of species of Inocybe, certain Clatocybees, some Entoloma, apparently some Mycena, It's been reported in Omphaloctus illudens. It's seen in low doses in Amanita muscaria, and it may be responsible for that heightened agitation that's part of the picture of Amanita muscaria ingestion. I'd love if there's any doctors on the line to talk about that. Kevin says there is some evidence that monomethylhydrazine poisoning might increase the lifetime risk of ALS. Fascinating. I would love to see the literature around that. Yeah. Thank you, Kevin. So in Asabi, those little brown mushrooms of fiber caps as a group, though many of them are not have fibrous caps. It's a large group of tiny mushrooms which are not well studied. And if you rely on field guides, they may have 4 or 5 or 6 species. And so there's many out there that people don't know. People, again, make assumptions. So challenging ID in the best of times. They're beautiful, photogenic little mushrooms. And Asabi geophylla, particularly the variety Lilacina, I find it sometimes in wood chips along the base of planted trees. So growing mycorrhizally with the trees, but in the wood chips in the fall in fairly high numbers. So pretty common. Some of the Anosapes, the Antilomas can contain muscarine as well. So the key to this, I think, is identifying the symptomology when someone comes in the ED, and to react on that symptoms. Next group is the anabuse reaction, coparine or related, those mushrooms which trigger a reaction when alcohol is consumed with them or following ingestion. This, I could not find my club-footed Clitosabe, the Ampulo Clitosabe clavipes. So I borrowed this from Matthew Sicard out of Michael Quebec. So often these are edible mushrooms where there's only a problem if the alcohol is consumed. So I always ask, what's the toxin? Is it the mushroom or is it the alcohol? Obviously, it's a synergistic effect. So the triggering is like the medication anabuse or disulfiram that is used as a treatment to try and prevent people or discourage people from drinking alcohol. Nausea, vomiting, rapid heartbeat, flushing within about 15 minutes if a mushroom is eaten. And what we've learned is you can eat the mushroom today and up to 72 hours after, if you drink alcohol, some people have that reaction. So the alcohol inky Coprinopsis atramentarius is the famous one, but the club-footed Clitosabe as well, occasionally, for some people, species of Morchella. And I've heard also occasionally that people react to Ladioporus if they consume alcohol with it. We were all built differently. So the alcohol inky in New England is really common in the late spring and common again in the late summer, early fall as things cool down. It's a saprobe typically from buried wood, but also sometimes around the base of a dead or rotting stump or tree. Typically hardwood. People love this. It's a good edible unless you insist on having that glass of wine with your meal. I love this mushroom. It's robust. This is the one on the photograph on the left was actually, some of it was pushing through the edges of concrete from buried wood, that powerful reaction. And it can range from kind of grayish white to more tan. Pretty little mushroom. Hard to clean sometimes. I want to talk about a couple of groups of the psychoactive mushrooms, and ibutenic acid muscimol being the one group, and the psilocybin, psilocin, baeocystin containing indoles on the other. For the psilocybin group, these are mind-altering and with an onset typically within 60 minutes, often earlier, with a duration of symptoms up to about 5 hours that include euphoria, that mind expansiveness, heightened perception of color, and some sense of ecstasy that breaks down the sense of difference between us and the rest of the universe. Sometimes hallucinations, sometimes delusions. Significant history of ritualistic abuse. We learned about these as the pop culture from Look magazine, no, excuse me, Life magazine, back in the late 1950s, from Gordon Wasson and his trips down to central Mexico. So there was a lot of research into use of psilocybin back in the late 1950s and early 60s, some promising stuff that got shut down when the abuse really took off and the federal government banned it. And now that's coming back. And the significant research that's been done through Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic Studies that was really carefully laid out, really using careful double blinding, is much more appropriate and quite exciting in some of the work that's being done for treating depression and anxiety, some great studies with anxiety at the end of life in elders, some work around PTSD and trauma. Just some interesting stuff. And what worries me, boy, is this way trendy. Way trendy. I worry about the hype getting ahead of the knowledge base. And psilocybin in this group is quite dangerous for infants and toddlers. It can really spike a high fever and even convulsions. So anabuse disulfiram has been used to experimentally microdose to block growth of certain cancers. That's a new one on me. What are the long-term effects of mind-altering mushrooms on the brain? Very good question, and I wish I could answer it. And I think maybe over time we'll be in a better place to do that. So of the psilocybin-containing mushrooms that are relatively common in New York, or excuse me, in New England and the Northeast, several species of Gymnopolis. Luteus is the most robust one we have up here. Several species of psilocybe, as well as a couple of others, Paniolina phoenici. And for the ibotenic acid muscimol, I will deal with those separately next. This is the haymaker's mushroom or lawnmower's mushrooms, Paniolina phoenici, and there's a couple related species of Paniolus that are related that also contain the compounds. So these are probably one of our more common lawn-growing mushrooms in the midsummer and late summer, and occasionally they contain the actionable levels of psilocybe or psilocybin. The Gymnopolis luteus, and we can argue which species we have up here sometimes. This is a saprobic mushroom that's pretty common on dead hardwoods. I find it most commonly on birch and maple, occasionally on beech. Very distinctive annulus that, because the bright orange-brown spores drop, you can really pick up the annulus. Pretty common, and there's another related species that I've found occasionally on clusters from buried wood. So pretty handsome little mushroom, sometimes fairly robust, up to 4 or so inches in diameter. The psilocybe group, you know, boy, this is a moving target. We have several species occasionally that are found in the Northeast, psilocybe semilaciniata. I found this psilocybe, which I believe is quebecensis, in central Maine a few years back. You know, that telltale staining is indicative of the psychoactive compounds. Spore print kind of blackish purple. Not easy identification for someone who's not familiar with the group. And then I want to talk a little bit, I'm worried about Amanita muscaria, that group of mushrooms with the ibotenic acid and muscimol, because I'm finding more people experimenting with it. The active compounds, ibotenic acid, muscimol, the onset of symptoms within 1 to 3 hours, oftentimes starting out with nausea, sometimes vomiting, often agitation, shakes, staggering, incoordination, sometimes triggering significant deep sleep or periods of sleep interspersed with agitated wakening, sometimes hallucinations and visual distortion, and at times even possible convulsions at high doses. So this is common in Amanita muscaria, but there's a couple of the former Amanita pantherina group, Volatipes, crenulata, multisquamosa, that have significant contents as well. So rarely fatal, but can be truly unpleasant, particularly if you don't know what you're eating. This year, I had at least two cases where people claimed they didn't know what they were eating. They thought it was edible, had significant symptoms, got scared and showed up in an emergency department. And in both of these cases, one was a couple in their 70s, one was a man in his early 50s. The story of, I thought it was something else, I thought it was edible, doesn't quite ring true. And I'm talking to a lot of people who are interested in or playing with this. I worry about the kind of the negative experiences that people have. And I'm curious if in other parts of the country we're seeing this. The Amanita muscaria variety Gassawii we have here, oh my word, some years you can almost walk across certain areas. They've been so common. Last fall, even through the summer, I saw them intermittently, and then a very heavy fruiting in the fall. Very distinctive color, just beautiful mushroom. And this is one where dogs seem to be attracted to it with sometimes fatal results. And this is one of the rare mushrooms that even those picky eating cats that we own will occasionally be attracted to and eat these. And we've had some deaths of both. So Blitz says you need to prepare Amanita very carefully. Yeah, I know it's out there, but who's doing it right? Who's doing it well? I think that we're learning, and people are not doing it thoughtfully. And I do know that there's, starting back, I believe it was Rubel who published initially, the history and the way of preparing this as an edible. So it can be boiled with the ibotenic acid leached out and used that way. Again, falls into that why bother for me. I'm showing this photograph because I find this mushroom in Maine, in New England, fruiting up to and after the first frost. And sometimes when it's been frost kissed, you come up with this gorgeous, deep orange coloration on them. And I can't think of any other thing other than the frost on it that triggers that. So can fly agaric be used as a fly trap? Boy, I hear stories that historically it's been used that way, and then I hear stories that say, I think that's bunk. So let's see. Yeah, I believe, in terms of edibility, it should be in that why bother category. Now this one, Amanita volatipes, which sometimes I find in fairly high numbers. There was a case some years ago up in Quebec with a very severe poisoning with this that was almost fatal. So this is like an Amanita muscaria on steroids in terms of the content of ibotenic acid and muscimol. It's not uncommon in even suburban or urban areas on lawns in the early summer and sometimes late summer, early fall. And oftentimes, like this one, looks very much like a muscaria, other than the base of the stipe, the top of the bulb is somewhat collared. And there's ranges of this. I'm not totally convinced that the left and upper right mushrooms are volatipes, but I couldn't get it to anything closer than that. And related to those, in the same group of toxins and significant contents of ibotenic acid is Amanita crenulata, Amanita multisquamosa. And I dealt with a case, fortunately, this family collected a group of crenulata this summer, and they made a soup of them. And they must not have cooked that soup enough, because all of them got, well, one of them didn't get sick at all, but the rest of them got pretty ill with a range of symptomology. So just be aware, people's passion, and because these are pretty gorgeous mushrooms that can be often in urban or not so much urban, but suburban and rural areas. So this is a mushroom, the Amanita muscaria at least, that has an illustrious past. It's in Central Europe. It is one of those symbols of good fortune and good luck for the new year. And somehow it's tied in with Christmas. When Alice in Wonderland was written, it was just after some of the initial reports coming out of Siberia about the indigenous peoples in that area using this as a ritualistic mushroom. And so he got woven into Alice in Wonderland, into that story with the caterpillar, with the hookah, you know that one. But also there's this belief that the reindeer that pull Santa across the sky, Santa in that bright red Amanita muscaria color, at least the Western and European form, reindeer love it. In areas where reindeer are herded, they have to be careful of them in the late summer and fall when the Amanita muscaria fruits, because reindeer love mushrooms and they love Amanita muscaria over most, and they'll eat it and they'll get, well, to say the least, frisky. They might even get high. So the belief that the reindeer can fly is directly related to their love affair with Amanita. And we can go into some real detail about urine and such like that, but we won't do that tonight. So Bill says Amanita muscaria is the pinup of the mushroom world. Absolutely. It is by far the most illustrated and photographed mushroom in history. So sliding into the seventh category, the gastrointestinal irritants, by far the most common reported mushroom poisoning symptomology, related to a number of compounds acting in a number of different ways, but always triggering some kind of reaction in the gut. Onset can vary, but typically 1 to 2 hours. It's typically time limited, though I'm going to give you a couple of cases where it tends to be longer. And if it's the onset of gastrointestinal symptoms is delayed more, you need to really look, is this a different toxin? So cramps, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, you know the drill. Myself, I hate vomiting, so I tend to stay away from it. So the frequently included genera, certain groups of Ruschula, certain Lactarius species, certain Agaricus, particularly the yellow staining ones, fortunately not the ones that are particularly common in the Northeast, boletes, Hebeloma, Ladioporus, Heronensis especially. Some people react to Ladioporus sulphureus the same way. Omphalotus, scleroderma, Trichomoma, Ramaria, a bunch of different ones. And we're going to talk a little maybe about Ramariopsis as well. The one that is probably the poster child for gastrointestinal distress in terms of the mushroom world is Chlorophyllum molybdites, the green-spored Lepiota. Fortunately, to date, it's coming really close. We have not seen it in Maine, but it's been reported just over the border in Massachusetts, maybe into New Hampshire with warming weather. I'm expecting to see it, but really common in the mid-Atlantic and in the South and in the Midwest as a lawn mushroom, sometimes in gorgeous fairy rings and clusters. It's a large mushroom, 3 to 4 inches in diameter easily, and sometimes larger. So it looks beautiful. Sometimes people mistake it for some of the edible Lepiota group, Rhacoides procera, which it's not. It, in some years, is the most frequent or common culprit for people getting sick. The one that I promised I would talk about is the Omphallotus. Omphallotus illudens in the Northeast. Common mushroom growing from buried wood at the base, or from a butt rotter, from the base of a tree, or from buried wood where it's been removed. Here in Maine, by and large, I find it only on oak. And I'd love to hear what species of trees people find in other areas. Bright, true jack-o'-lantern orange, and it's called jack-o'-lantern because of the color, that pumpkin color of the cap, but also because it glows in the dark. True bioluminescence. If the gills are fresh and you get into a dark room, this eerie green glow is just gorgeous. And curiously, every year I have cases where people think they're eating chanterelles. And the pattern of the gills, the knife edge gills, and the cespitose growing clusters, the bright orange color of the cap, all very different than chanterelles, but some people make the mistake. So here, oops, I did something wrong here. Are people seeing the slide? I've got something blinking mine.
We can see the slide.
Perfect, that's all I need.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Sigrid. So here's the typical way I find it up in the Northeast. Growing near the base of a large tree that is doing a butt rotting, the saprobic rotting of the major roots and the lower end of the stalk, and growing in dense clusters. Dense meaning sometimes 50, 60, 70, 80 mushrooms. And the photograph in the bottom right here shows the combination of a small cluster of the jack-o'-lantern, the Omphallotus, and a few of the golden chanterelle. And
okay, we're not seeing that, sorry. We're just seeing the big picture of the jack.
All right, so hang on a second. I think I got stuck. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and reshare.
Okay, now we're in business.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ingrid. So on the bottom right-hand side here, you can see the kind of mustard golden yellow of the chanterelles and the orange cespitose jack-o'-lantern that you can't really see in this photograph, the knife edge gills of the Omphallotus. I try and have both of them in as many classes as I can, so because once people see the two, they're never going to make the mistake. This is a mushroom where if you eat it, you're going to have at least 5 to 7 hours of really severe gastrointestinal pyrotechnics. And way often, I think the place that I worry most is people find this gorgeous cluster of Omphallotus, and there's so many that they can't eat all of them, so they gift them to other people, telling them they're chanterelles. And if you ever have a call from someone says, oh, I found this great big cluster of chanterelles and I'm going to eat them, try and call them back right away. And hopefully they haven't warmed up the saute pan. So others, some of the entelomas, the small ones, also are a GI irritant. They also may contain muscarine, as I said. And I want to talk about the boletes. You know, people, particularly Europeans, come to this country and say, you know, all boletes are edible. Yeah, you might get a little bit of GI upset, but yeah, basically they're all edible, except for some of those blue staining red pored ones. And so there's more of an assumption of safety around the boletes. And increasingly, I'm seeing a number of cases each year with people sickened. The red pored blue stainers have always been suspect, although people sometimes are starting to push the limits on those, test them out. Good for them, don't give them to me. So in the Northeast, there's a couple I'm really trying to underscore. This is the one that got me. Stylopolis eximius, then now it's Sutorius eximius. It's probably going to be in some other genus before I can blink. The lilac brown bolete. And in the Southeast, North Carolina, apparently they eat this species pretty commonly. In 1986, I found just a gorgeous collection of them, meaty, firm, beautiful. I came home, I looked it up in 3 books, including Linkoff's Audubon guide, and all of them called it edible. Linkoff said there was no toxic lookalikes, so I ate it, sauteed it up, olive oil, garlic, salt and pepper, added some cream to make a sauce, had it over linguine with some Parmesan. It was really tasty until about 2.5 hours later. And I started to feel the symptoms. I had gone to work. I was working as a bartender at the time. So I knew something was up. It had to be the mushroom. I figured I would get sick and that'd be it. Literally, it was about 12 hours of gastrointestinal. My coworkers got upset enough that they called an ambulance, which was very embarrassing. So really extended period of GI distress up in the Northeast, Quebec, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, at least Massachusetts. I've been aware of at least 30 cases, or probably more now, sometimes with multiple people sickened after eating this mushroom. And yet some field guides are still saying, well, some people are reporting problems. I say, avoid this mushroom at all cost. And I'd love to have, if we have anybody from North Carolina here, if you eat it down there, is it different? This is a mushroom that is nasty. And the lilac brown bolete, the young ones, you can really see why it's called the lilac brown. As it ages, it's the brown bolete. So Jana said, I tasted it, but it was bitter. I didn't find it bitter. Yeah, and Orab said, you should always eat a little bit. And boy, did I learn a whole lot in 1986 in terms of my future of edibility. You're right. I would say just don't eat it. Gorgeous, beautiful mushroom, though. Another one that I struggle with, and I'm using sensibilis or Lemmus sensibilis as a stand-in for all of the mushrooms in the bolete group that are yellow pored with some plus or minus blue staining and some combination of red and yellow colors. And if you work to identify them, sometimes you can be 100% sure of what they are. Sometimes you can't. Is it edible? Is it not? Every year or two, I deal with cases with gastrointestinal distress of people eating red and yellow boletes with yellow pores that have some level of blue staining. It's a complex group that I think is challenging for anybody to understand. And some of you may well be happy to throw questions or throw rocks at me on this, but be careful. And then certainly the Neoboletus subvolutipes. We've been having it on our toxic list, and yet some people saying, I'm eating it well cooked, it's not too bad. That's that pushing those limits. Be careful. Some people are pushing it. Very rapid, instant blue staining. There's a couple related species that are pretty similar. Caution is my direction in this. And this is one for those of us in the north. I really want people to understand and learn Boletus heronensis. No common name is around. This is at times confused with the Edulis group. And it resembles some of what's called the butter boletes in the Western United States, that pale yellow flesh, yellow pores. The pores stain blue, and sometimes the flesh does. This is a big, robust, beautiful mushroom. Tends to hang out with hemlocks. And I have dealt with it several cases. We've heard about other cases, sometimes very severe prolonged gastrointestinal, some blood platelet involvement. Just beware. And I borrow this photo from Mary Ulina. I don't know if she's on the call and can talk about her experience. She also was sickened by this one. And these are two that I collected up in Washington County on the right-hand side there. And I just used the blunt end of the pin to scratch into the pores, not an edulus. And very rapidly, the blue staining came up. No net veining. occasionally I hear reports of some reticulation at the very top. So Heronensis, actually a member of the Neoboletus by DNA. Thank you, Igor. So I don't know how far south this is found. Has been reports down in New Hampshire, certainly common, more common the further north you get into Maine. It occurs up into Canada in a number of provinces. So this is a photograph. Michaeline Mulvey and I were teaching at Eagle Hill a few years ago, and we typically do that 5-day seminar in the beginning of August. And often I get calls from the Poison Center during the class, and they're wonderful teaching moments. So we got this call, and the people at the Poison Center, who are just a wonderful staff, they said, Greg, we don't think you can do anything with this, but we want to put it by you. We got a call from a Russian, and he's on his way to the airport to fly back. He was here visiting someone and took his girlfriend and her adult sons out foraging, and the two of the sons got sick. And he said, I think it's the sep. But this is the only picture we had. So they sent this to me. And you can see lovely black trumpets, some chanterelles, gorgeous Grifola umbellata, a mixed bag of different boletes, some chanterelles, and right in that lower right-hand corner, one big emerging button. And, Michaeline and I looked at this and we immediately pointed to that one. Yes. And it was Boletus heronensis. Oops. And, it used to be when I learned my mushrooming and started out, and we're going back 45 years or so, Lexinum was also always considered one of those safe ones. Yeah, you can chase them. And yet the 30-year compilation of mushroom poisonings show that about 3% of our poisonings across the country were attributed to Lexinum. I deal with cases once or twice a year. Sometimes they're clearly undercooked or raw, sometimes not. So significant GI distress. So as estimated, there's 100 species of this. They're difficult to identify as species. They can be cryptic. So I think that people don't know necessarily what species they're eating. And they're particularly problematic if they're undercooked. And there's some people who just love their red-capped Lexinums who are going to be pushing against this, but just prudence and caution. It's not on my eating list anymore. And we go to great lengths in terms of splitting and checking for discoloration at the base of the stipe and changes in color over time to ID, but boy, there's some overlapping characteristics. Certainly, I want to acknowledge the scleroderma citrina, and this is one where some people can eat it well, and others can't. Immediately within like 20 minutes, rapid onset of GI distress. Very common, very beautiful. Don't eat them. And then finally, I want to talk about the corals and the problematic. Certainly, the genus Romeria is really hard for most people to identify. I'm going to even skip at some of those cause problem like Formosa, but I want to talk about this one, Romeriopsis. Romeriopsis kunzii is a very common species in the Northeast. Some people eat it and really enjoy it, but there's a look-alike, Lentofragilis. And I think most of us, if we've been in this game long enough, learned about that as a question back from a mushroom foraging expedition that was done here in Maine about 35 years ago, where there were about 5 people thinking they ate kunzii who got pretty sick. A couple of them ended up hospitalized. And so there's this species Lentofragilis, and you can tell them apart by a staining reaction with iron sulfate. One stains blue, one stains green. But if you're not doing that test, you're not going to necessarily tell the difference. We had a case this summer where a couple in a homesteading situation ate a number of mushrooms, and Kelly Hoot went back and did some collecting to try and understand. That wasn't Kelly, excuse me, it was Willow Cullen, and to try and understand what they had eaten. And one of the things he found or they found, was Romeriopsis that seemed to be lentofragilis in terms of its staining reaction. It's pretty significant, even liver onset with these ones. So be cautious. And then certainly there are mushrooms we have to be careful about because some people react to them. And those that are not cooked well or fall into that case, and always the idiosyncratic. And I bring you this quote, which I just love. And I don't know who MV is. I found this online and have borrowed it. I've never been able to figure out where it came from. But she says, you know, I can eat anything. I mean anything. But 1 teaspoon of a cooked puffball, just about the most benign, recognizable mushroom you can find, will cause me the kind of grief I'd rather not describe here. Now, my husband, he can eat them until the cows come home. On the other hand, I can happily devour a plate full of pine mushrooms, a bolete, but this same mushroom will cause my husband the same kind of reaction I'd prefer not to describe. It's very, very individual. I don't know why, it just is. That is a little wordy, but one of the best descriptions of an idiosyncratic reaction that I've heard. Because some of us are just not going to agree with certain species. Is it an allergy? You know, what's the cause? We don't know, but it's there. So pay attention in yourself. Honey mushrooms can be like that, and some of those may be undercooked. Laetioporus, absolutely. So think about it. And some of those that will do that, we see here. And I think I want to just about end there. Other than I want to talk about Paxillus syndrome, that we still get reminded of. Many people, this can trigger a GI distress, but occasionally you get an antigen reaction where someone who's been eating this for a while will develop antibodies, and you eat it again, and it can really trigger significant hemolytic anemia, including death. So that's one we're paying attention to. We have a couple species up here. And the Aurelianine syndrome, we're learning that a couple of species of Cortinarius, rubellus being the most common one that I find up here, do contain Aurelianine, and that is a potentially deadly species. We've had a couple of species, a couple of North American incidents of that, one in Michigan. And this curiosity around the Pleurisabella porogens, the angel wings, growing on well-rotted conifer wood. And it seems that people with a compromised kidney can have real problems if they eat very much of it. It might be a dose related. And I think that's where I'm going to end. I want to make sure everyone has, if you're a risk taker in terms of your eating mushrooms, tattoo the poison control number onto your wrist. Be prepared to talk to them. They're good folks. At least the ones up here are wonderful. And I suspect they're pretty patient. We did kind of a confusing edible and toxic mushroom look-alike guide a few years ago that's available. So here we go. I'm going to basically stop it here, other than one just shameless PR. Michaeline and I are going to be back up at Eagle Hill for our mushroom camp, we call it, mushroom identification for the new mycophiles, July 24th to July 30th this year. If you've never been to Eagle Hill, it is wonderful. It's a fun place. We work people's butts off and everybody has a great time. So look up, it's www.eaglehill.us. And I think we're going to stop there. So I often end with Rumi because I just, beauty here. Let the beauty you love be what you do. There are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the earth. And for me, mushrooming is one of them. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to all of you. And I saw there was a question in there about a black prince. You'll have to tell us what a black prince is.
You can all unmute yourselves if you have a question that you want to ask. So yes, would the asker of the question please ask it?
Thanks, Jen Butler, for putting that in, www.eaglehill.us.
I'm sorry, it might have been a black knight or something. There was a bunch of people collecting a whole bunch of them in the late fall, and I identified it with a CGAP, and it said like, oh, it's been recently known as being an issued mushroom, but previously it was eaten a lot. And then they were very upset after I read that to them, because they just collected a whole bag full. But yeah, I think it was called the Black Prince or the Night Prince or something Prince. I don't know.
It could have been, I mean, there's a group of agaricus that are sometimes called the prince, but based on that name, I don't know it. Is anybody?
Sorry,
Yeah, it's okay.
sorry, I don't have the specifics.
Common names become an issue because they're local.
Yeah. Or an author just makes them up on their own.
I'm going to start with Michael Hall's question, if he would like to unmute himself and ask it. I think he
yeah.
have.
Yeah, I was wondering, if we suspect that we may have ingested something less than wholesome, what's basically when do we call 911?
I think that's a wonderful question, Michael. Really, one of the key things is work to find out what you ate, because that's going to be a little bit indicative of possibly the range of symptomology and how dangerous it's going to be. Also, make sure you're aware, if you've eaten it or other people have eaten it, what's your basic health status? So I've known people who have driven to the emergency room and spent the night in the parking lot because they didn't want to go in and get the charge unless they absolutely needed to. So, as an adult, be prudent. If you've got good insurance, that may help guide you. I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much.
And the next person I wanted to ask their question is Jonathan Amantia.
Yeah.
Do you remember what it was? It was
The
about
question that's, sorry,
sulfur shelf?
Ah,
the question that I had?
Nope, Jonathan Amantia. Are you? You're not.
That's me, yeah.
Oh,
I'd had a question about chicken of the woods, and you had a slide on chicken of the woods, and
Yep.
but then it was clarified that if you don't cook it enough, or if it's old, then it can be an issue.
chicken in the woods, it's an interesting, there's a small cluster of species that we include in that group, Jonathan. And we know, maybe up to 5 to 10% of people don't deal well with it. They can't tolerate it. And certainly if it's uncooked or undercooked, guaranteed you're going to get sick. And then some people tend to collect it and try and use it when it's too old and tough and leathery. Yeah.
I collected probably 60 pounds of it last year, and I barbecued it all and had a chicken in the woods party. Everybody was pretty happy.
There's no faulting success.
And by the way, it was called a gray night. My mistake. That mushroom I was referring to. It's called a gray night.
oh, it's a tricholoma.
Yeah.
Yeah, the gray night.
Yeah.
Tricks
And-
are tricky.
Yeah.
And you had a picture of morels and false morels. The two in the middle were the real morels, right? And the ones on the outside were the false ones in your slide. Okay.
That's
thank you.
correct. In that particular slide.
Christina, you had a question about a beginning kit.
Any kit.
Yeah, you mentioned iron sulfate, and it identifies something by stating, I think the bleed's either blue or green. I was just wondering, so I've been foraging for a little while and I just stick to the basics because I know of scary things, but is there any next step up? Should I carry a tiny bottle of various substances to identify in the field?
Yes.
What are you, what's the next step?
We call them potions and unguents. But yes, I mean, you can get various reactions on mushrooms, and some people really work with that a lot, with a number of different types of compounds, ferrous sulfate being only one of them. And I would really, rather than go into depth on that, take a good course or work with someone, maybe a mycological association, where you might be able to get some of those prepared at a less cost. Are you part of a mushroom group in your area?
Yes, I'm with the Philadelphia Mycology Club. I'm sure someone in there is probably a wealth of knowledge. Just got to find them.
I suspect you're right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Good
Thank you.
question.
Let's see, there's somebody that got Lisa. Let's start talking about poisonings. Do you want to talk about your experience with oyster mushrooms?
Sure. Hi. So I had I was growing them and I cooked them and in my memory, this happened a few years ago. I'm remembering I was in a hurry and I had to get one of my children to school and it was pretty bad. I got really sick. And I'm thinking I just didn't cook them well enough, but I belong to a mycology group here. And I'm thinking what happened. I think I'm just allergic to them. So I just stay away from them now. I'm not going to chance it again.
Mhm.
But I have heard that some people are allergic to them. And I was just wondering if maybe he could talk about that. And also the sulfur tuft mushroom. I was wondering about the poison with that.
I think it's a gastrointestinal irritant, Neotilloma fasciculare is what I call that, if that's what you mean. With the oyster mushrooms and any mushrooms and an allergic reaction, that falls into, how is it interacting with us? And some people develop a sensitivity or an allergy, it could be an allergy, to mushrooms after eating them for a while. And we don't know why. You could have, if those mushrooms were undercooked, it might have been the problem. Or the other thing that I've seen, if someone, and I would say less common if someone if you're growing them, though that can happen, if you eat too many, a massive
Okay.
amount of mushrooms will overwhelm your system and can cause some pretty significant, either you can bind you up or it can loosen you up significantly. And that include, I know a couple of people where that happened with the treasure trove of black trumpets they had last year.
Hmm.
Just about the most tasty, benign mushroom I know.
Wow.
And we
Okay.
had,
Thank you.
Jean, you had an experience with too many mushrooms. Would you like to describe that?
Finally found my unmute button. Yes, hallelujah. Yeah. Yeah, no, it was gluttony. It was just one of those evenings with a bunch of people and we all decided to have the mushroom tasting menu and two of us got very sick and two didn't. So I've never eaten that quantity of mushrooms before and I never will again. And I'm quite sure it was just over consumption of mushrooms.
Nothing like a good clean out.
It was a very good clean out and I left a very good tip for the hotel maid.
Oh, Jean, you're wonderful.
So I want more details, Jean. Was it both ends? Was it sitting and kneeling or?
I don't want more details.
It was Steve and me fighting for position. It came
All right.
down to that.
Can someone mute her, please?
Oh my God, this is amazing. I am so happy to be part of this.
All right, we're gonna get off of details briefly and Aura.
Hey, you asked for him.
Aura, you had a question about the difference between two amanitas. Would you like to talk about that?
Maybe not. Well, I see a lot of Ladioporus problems, which doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. The question that Arab had was, what's the difference between Amanita crenulata and Amanita muscaria?
Oh, a huge difference. And any field guide can work you through that. Crenulata is typically smaller. It's more finely boned. It's tan. It does have the remnants of the veil, oftentimes as little warts on the top of the cap. And I typically find it in very different habitat. I typically find it fruiting most heavily mid to late summer, though there's some overlap there. And anybody can add to this as well.
Any further comments from anybody? We'll move on then. Garrett, you had a comment about Tricholoma dulceolens, which is a mushroom I'm not familiar with. And tell us about how you identified it.
DNA, ITS. Yeah, I've never found Tricholoma magnivelare here, and I really wanted to know what it was. And I tried it once, and it didn't work. But I tried it again when I found it again, and it worked this time. So I got a name for it, and it's actually right next to. It was right next to a Tricholoma that I called Stans, I think, but is not that. Is now getting new name.
Huh, interesting.
But it's a delicious mushroom. I actually took and fed it to a bunch of people, and alongside Tricholoma magnivelare, like a couple years later, when I actually found a whole bunch of that, and I compared it, like I took like a survey. I cooked it the exact same way and gave it to 2 groups of people, and 16 people chose the dulceolens versus 15 the magnivelare, and I agreed with them.
All right, interesting.
What was the habitat for dulceolens?
It's a spruce habitat.
Same. It's hemlock, and it has a bleachard, the podzol type soil.
Yeah.
And it had a little bit of bleachard attached to the base, just like magnivelare does.
Thank you.
This is a good one. Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm loving the reading through the chat.
Which question do you want to answer next, Greg?
I'm just blown away. Yeah, enough very graphic stories though.
How about Anna Cosmo? How about your story with your dear spouse?
Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, and now listening a little bit more to some of the things that may have been mixed in with those bullies, it may have been a scaber stock. I mean, it was just like having a huge foray and then eating probably a bit much, but there could have just been something, one little thing. And it was my spouse, very, very, very careful. We do not eat anything that we can't for sure identify and double or triple check. But he just didn't feel good the next day, and it really got the attention of his physician very quickly. He didn't feel it was a need for going to the hospital or anything, but it just seemed to be lasting a little bit. But we see all kinds of things because we have a German short-haired pointer that we run around with that helps us to find mushrooms. He's trained,
yes, I'll bet.
Which is great, but we just don't eat in the experiment. But that one time, it was just, he just didn't feel well, and very, very careful. Anything that's bitter, we taste, just put on the tongue. It's no way, we're not going to eat it. We don't recognize. So yeah, that's my story. And
so I want to kind of bring in overarching. Mushrooms are hard to digest. They're hard to digest because their cell wall makeup is a mixture of chitin, these long chain indigestible polysaccharides. And the cooking helps break them up and make the nutrients available. Also sometimes can neutralize some of the heat labile toxins. So cooking mushrooms helps, but even then I have a close friend who really suggests you don't eat more mushrooms than can fit in the palm of your hand. Right, Michaeline?
Yes.
So eat a small. But I want to go back to a comment in here from Kelly, who said, my husband says that in the Middle Ages, arsenic was the most deadly known poison. And to test the monarch's food, a silver pin was inserted into food. And if the poison was there, the silver pin turns black. Interesting. And so maybe from there was an assumption that it tested for other poisons. I'd have to check that out. Thank you, Kelly, for adding that.
So the folks that pick morels out of apple orchards that were old enough to be treated with fungicide based on arsenic might want to check their morels with a silver coin.
Yeah, good point. So for years, the major pesticide was lead arsenate, and that's quite stable in the soil and can be accumulated in morels years later.
Greg, this isn't anybody's question, but it's mine. Would you elaborate on the proper protocol around eating mushrooms? How many species you might want to eat at a time? You've already addressed how much at a time.
Yeah, what I strongly recommend for people who's starting out, if you're collecting and eating mushrooms for the first time, you're only eating one species at a time. Because if you go out and you find 5 species and you cook them all together and you eat them all and you get sick, that's 5 species of mushrooms you'll never eat again. And you don't know which one did it, right? So, and also it enables you to appreciate the texture and the taste of each species if you do them separately.
And how much do you eat when it's the first time you've eaten it, and who would you share it with?
My habit, and by now, if I'm eating a new species, you know, it's out there. I'm the only one that eats it. I don't feed it to my wife or my child, and I certainly would never take it to the potluck dinner. And, you know, so I eat a little bit, you know, maybe a couple of mouthfuls to try it out and then see if that works and then eat it later. And for me, eating new species, often it'll take me 3 or 4 collections of it until I really know it, at least earlier on, especially before I feel comfortable eating it. I'm cautious. And maybe that's the reason I've only been sickened once.
Jana, you had a story about Amanita muscaria in a dehydrator. Would you like to unmute yourself and talk about that?
Hi, everyone. I will try to. So yes, last year in October, late in the season, I found Amanita. It was a small one, and it wasn't opened up completely. And I decided to dehydrate it because someone told me that if you dehydrate it, it's gonna stay like new, fresh, right? So I can show it to other people, so it doesn't go bad. And when I put it in my dehydrator, after like 45 or 50 minutes, I started being dizzy. My eyes were burning. I felt really weird. So I called my friend and she was like, "What's happening? What are you doing?" And she called her other friend who's a specialist on amanitas. And he says, yes, this can happen to some people. The vapors from dehydration, right, from the process, you should always dry them with the open windows. And my windows were obviously not opened. But when I spoke to other people about this, they were like, "Oh, that's not possible. You're just making this up." So that was my story. I didn't eat it or anything, right? It was just sitting in my dehydrator for like 45 or 50 minutes. And I felt really strange, really weird. So does anyone have an experience like that or?
No, that's interesting, Janet. Yeah.
And when I turned off the machine and I opened the windows, after like half hour, it was gone. The headache, the burning eyes and all that stuff, that was completely gone. So
do you remember what species you were drying?
It was Amanita muscaria for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. It was, I would say, a few inches tall. I would say like 6 inches tall. Yeah.
I have no idea. I'm curious if anybody else has some. Yeah. Jonathan, you had a question. Was that related to the one you put in the chat as well?
It was the indigo.
Oh yeah, so you were asking if there's instances of the Lactarius indigo causing
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, great.
It's pretty accepted. It's one of those, I call it the Dr. Seuss mushroom, because even though it's blue when it's fresh, when you cook it, it turns green. So if you want the
Yeah.
green beans and ham experience, try cooking that mushroom.
All right. Yeah, no, I enjoyed it on the barbecue. It was really, really good. Cool. Thank
Blitz, you had a question about the long-term effects of mind-altering mushrooms.
Mm. I think we're going to know that more over time. Certainly, growing up, we were given all kinds of stories, and I do know people that, particularly after repeated dosage of psilocybin, I think it caused some significant effect. I don't know about not psilocybin, of LSD. Repeated doses of LSD cause problems long term, but I don't know about psilocybin. I've not heard of anything, but I think we're going to be learning a lot as we move forward. Anybody have done any research into that area?
I'm not hearing anybody. So how about DA White? You had a question about vitamin C injections and amanita poisoning.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I read a book by Pierre Bastien, an old book from years ago, where he claimed that injecting like certain doses of vitamin C could treat poisoning from amanitas, different kinds. And I've heard that other people claiming that. Does anybody know what the follow-up on that was, like controlled studies?
I read some recent updates on some of those. There was also, the vitamin K and the penicillin and vitamin C, and mostly they're saying, I don't think so. They're really even questioning some of the milk thistle, although they're clearly saying that it's still helpful, but not the vitamin C as far as the recent information that I read, and that was a few months ago. Yeah.
Thanks.
Nancy Messer, you had an issue with turkey tails. Would you like to talk about that?
Can
you unmute yourself?
I did want to remind folks, and I meant to mention it earlier, that Uncle Don said that, brought up that Fungi Magazine published an article recently with kind of updates in the realm of toxic wild mushrooms. It probably be quite a good follow-up for all of you to read after this.
Nancy's question was, she took turkey tail from a log that she had been eating from for a few months. The last 2 times I took mushrooms from this log, I had GI issues big time. Why would that be? Same tree a little later, and then it made me sick.
It's hard to say. I would be really curious how you prepared the turkey tail, and were they still fresh and actively growing? Turkey tail is quite, persistent. It'll stay even after the fruiting body has died. It'll stay there, and other things can start to degrade it and break it down and cause problems. So I would really need a lot more information about the condition and the freshness of the mushrooms and how you prepare them. I'm hoping you prepared them as a broth and just drank the broth, because the body of the turkey tail is so fibrous, it's really difficult for us to digest, and it wouldn't sicken you, it wouldn't poison you, but our bodies, if we can't digest something, have a very effective mechanism for getting rid of them, one end or the other.
Tristan had a question about an antidote to amatoxin. Do you want to ask about that, Tristan?
Yes, hi. I read, and I'm sorry, I wish I could quote the review that I read this, but something that was supposed to start treating, they were experimenting on, that was treating amatoxin poisoning. Is that something that rings a bell? I would imagine if anyone knew, you would.
I think there's a lot of work in the treatment. I have heard no whisper or noise or suggestion of an antidote.
That works, right?
But particularly since it's much more common to have severe poisonings in parts of Europe, they're really ahead of America in a lot of the management of amatoxin poisoning. And part of it is we're hyperperfusion with fluids to really push things out through the kidneys as fast as possible. And to try and do everything they can to stabilize the liver, because if you can keep the liver alive, it will regenerate. And I don't pretend to be an expert in the realm of treatment, but that's certainly what I've read. Yeah.
Thank you.
Giselle, you had a question about charcoal pills. Would you like to ask that question?
She may not be able to unmute.
Yeah. Giselle had a question. Can we take charcoal pills in case of poisoning?
I don't know. I'm sure there's some poisons where that might be helpful in, but in emergency departments, they pretty much stopped giving activated charcoal unless it's within a very short time of the ingestion. So I would not particularly not do that in lieu of getting really clear about what the mushroom you have is, what its identification is, what its edibility is before you ever warm up the saute pan. I've not heard of any evidence to support that myself, and maybe other people here have.
D.W. Robinson had a question. I don't know if you're still there and can unmute to ask about the cautions around buying dried mushrooms.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I buy mushrooms at a local farmer's market, and sometimes they have packages of dried mushrooms labeled as porcinis. And I don't know if one can trust, local farmer's market of what you're really getting in a package of dried mushrooms.
So I guess what I would say, Mr. Robinson, is, do you know the person who collected and dried them? Or do you have a relationship? That's a great thing about a local farmer's market. You develop the relationship with the people who are providing the goods that are coming across the table. Whereas if you buy those mushrooms coming bulk out of Europe, oftentimes that's a mixture of the Boletus edulis group, and oftentimes Swillus luteus and a couple of other things that get mixed in. So buying dried mushrooms from across the world, you might need to be your own identifier in that realm. So no, I would build a relationship with the people who dried them and find out their knowledge base and whether you trust them.
Thank you.
Ari, you had a question about Amanita rubescens.
Yeah.
Yes. I have a question with regard to rubescens, also known as the blusher.
Yep.
Yeah, I have found that it's edible so long as it is cooked well. Do you have any knowledge of poisonings from this mushroom? It's fairly easy to recognize.
Yeah. I don't know of particular problems with rubescens, or Amur rubescens, as we're calling it now in this country. I recognize it as an edible. It's one of those mushrooms where, because it is part of a group where there's some toxic ones, I'm a little more cautious, and I'm certainly more cautious proselytizing for other people to use it. I had a friend who was learning mushrooming and using mushrooms to support his treatment for cancer. And he called me once on the phone. He said, Greg, I found all these blushers. And he described the characteristics. He says, yes, sound like blushers. He said, I want to eat them. I said, why? Why, are you pushing in that group when you've got compromised health already? You're hanging on the edge. Why bother? So to my mind, it falls in that category. There's some mushrooms I don't eat because they're just too associated with other things. That may be my cautious nature, but that's okay. I'm comfortable with that. The only Amanita that I have eaten, and I know there's a bunch of others that I recognize that are edible, I have eaten the Jacksonii a couple times. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I'm not that impressed with it, but it's so distinctive. But that's me. We all make our own decisions, and hopefully they're based on really, good thinking and good information.
I understand that it is, I personally have not tried it, rubescence, but from what I have heard from a wide range of sources, it's supposed to be a choice edible, very flavorful, and despite its hemolytic toxins, if it's cooked properly, it's really good.
There you go. You sounds like you're being careful in doing your homework. We all, at some point, we all gather the information and make our own choices. And I mean, this talk is based on the idea of making sure that some of the well-known common challenging mushrooms, we're shining a light on them, as well as we're shining a light on all the lovely edibles out there that we all enjoy.
Thank you.
There were a couple of questions. A couple of people noticed you had bluets in one of your photos. Tristan wanted to talk about that, and Joe Plusto. I don't know if either of you are still here and want to ask about it.
Yes, thank you. I just saw that you mentioned quickly on one of the slides that you went over without lingering on that bluet was one of the mushroom quotient. I was wondering why that was. I never heard poisoning or effect on bluets, but I do know that there's lookalikes, Cortinarius lookalike, which I actually, last time I picked bluets, luckily I was doing spore prints, and one of these Cortinarius sneaked in and looked very similar. I didn't check the gills, which is a telltale sign, but yes, wondering if it's because of that lookalike, or is it actually something that has to do with the Clycignuda?
Thank you for asking that, Tristan. I know I moved through that slide rather quickly because I wanted to get to the questions. The challenge with bluets is that if they are uncooked, they really trigger a pretty significant gastrointestinal reaction. So cooked, I mean, I love bluets. I collect and use them. I find them a very strong flavor that's quite pleasant. But if you eat them raw or undercooked, you're going to get sick. And I had a case in the Poison Center where a man who was a chef ate a bluet and had some pretty long-lasting gastrointestinal problems. And initially he told me he'd cooked it. Of course I cooked it, he said. And I checked back in with him the next day. He was still having some problems. And it was only after the third conversation that he admitted, no, actually I ate it raw.
Oh, okay.
It's just the need for cooking with those. But thank you for clarifying that. I'd skipped over that pretty quickly, Tristan.
Thank you. I do find that the more I try new species, as you mentioned for yourself, and I'm very careful when that happens. I eat like a spoonful, no more than that, and then a second meal later I'll eat a mouthful, and then I do 3 passes. But I do find that if I parboil some of the mushrooms that might be questionable for the reasons you mentioned, it tends to agree better with me. Sometimes, culinarily speaking, won't be as nice, but I think most of them actually can hold themselves quite well if you sponge out the water and saute them afterward. And I do eat Amanita ameryrubescens regularly, and I find it delicious, but I do parboil them for about 15 minutes before I saute them.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
I think one last question, unless somebody else writes in. Uncle Don B. Fireland Fanning had a question about cooking dried mushrooms that he's dried. Are you still here? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, what I've generally done is dehydrated them at low temperature, assuming that I'd be cooking them well upon rehydrating them. And that's an assumption. Did anybody have any advice for me on that? Should I cook them at a higher temperature when I'm drying them so that they get cooked twice? Or
I think so long as you're cooking them, before you eating them, that shouldn't be a problem. I've never read, the particular problem with people who've dried mushrooms that have, like morels, for instance, those heat labile toxins. As long as you cook them afterwards. And I think there's a challenge if you dry them at too high a temperature, it's going to mess, denature some of the proteins and likely to change the flavors. Yeah.
And I think one last question. Jana, you talked about treatment of poisoning. Can you unmute yourself maybe?
Yes. Well, I took a class past November online about the mushrooms and identification, and we talked about the poisoning and the treatments. And the person who was leading the class mentioned that they treated, like you mentioned, with hydration, right? Trying to flush out everything out of the body as soon as possible. But also they were talking about giving out something called Legalon, which is a milk thistle that helps the liver to recover.
And that was being used in this country under a kind of an experimental approval from the FTC. And the recent data or the recent report I saw was saying that basically they've never published the findings on that, so they're not sure. But early what I heard and what I'm hearing out of Europe is it has been fairly successful in supporting the liver. So I think what you learned was accurate as far as we know at this point.
Yes. Oh, that's good to know. Thank you.
And just to close it out, Esta has said she's a total newbie and she's never going to eat another mushroom.
Stick to the foolproof group, those ones that are common and easily identified without toxic lookalikes. And, that's maybe 6 or 8 or 10 mushrooms that might be all you ever need to eat.
I will too be cautious about how much I eat.
And if you only eat them with friends, that way you have to divide them up and it's easier.
I'll eat them with Jennifer.
All right. Hey, you guys have been wonderful. I was so hopeful that this is exactly what would happen, that I get this flood of stuff in the chat and questions, because you guys have so many experiences that I've never dealt with. And we learn from everybody's story. And we always have to evaluate the veracity of any story, but there have been wonderful stories tonight. And I certainly have learned a great deal. I thank you.
Thank you for an amazing talk. Really useful, but also really, really fun. And those two things don't always go together. So both thank you to you and to Michaeline as well for moderating and introducing. It was wonderful. Thank you all for coming this evening.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Right. Good night. Have a lovely weekend. Find somewhere else.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You're sure welcome.
Mhm.